You like steak?
I do.
I can deliver you steak.
Ah, the great American Steakhouse. A place you can go to get a thick slab of grilled beef and enough carb-loaded side dishes to hibernate for the winter. Despite not being invented in the US, steakhouses became an American institution thanks to their decadent menus and the promise of a high-quality cut of meat cooked to perfection. But after years on top, these former titans have faded in popularity while other dining trends have taken their place. So, what happened? Today, we're going to take a look at the rise and fall of American steakhouses. Before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History Food channel. After that, please leave a comment and let us know what other kind of restaurants you would like to hear about. Okay, vampires beware, because we're about to serve up some steaks. Technically speaking, steak is a general term that refers to how a certain piece of meat is cut and prepared. If it's a thick section of meat cut across the animal's muscle and cooked with high heat, on a grill or over an open flame, you've got yourself a steak. Historically speaking, steak first shows up in the record during the 15th century when Scandinavians started referring to thick cuts of meat from an animal's booty as stikna, stekja, or steak, spelled S-T-E-I-K, and meaning roasted meat. The word and the concept spread throughout Europe, and we still have centuries-old recipes for meals like steaks of venison or beef from England, which sounds like Borat trying to place an order at Longhorn.
Voice become a deep Borat.
But steak as we think of it really comes from Italy during the Renaissance. Florence, to be exact. Right around 1565, the Florentines declared August 10th to be the day of St. Lawrence, who, long story short, was a Roman martyr who had been tied to a grill and burned to death around 1300 years earlier. The Italians celebrated their hero's death by cooking slices of meat they called bistecca on huge, open-air, coal-powered grills. Every time you throw a steak on your own grill, you're symbolically eating St. Larry. It's also believed that the word bistecca was then picked up by English merchants, who it is believed anglicized it into beefsteak, and later just plain steak. The American beef industry is actually older than the United States itself. The whole thing got moving in the early 16th century when Spanish explorers introduced cattle to the North American continent. As the colonists moved further west, they brought those cattle with them. And it wasn't long before cattle ranching became a dominant force in American agriculture. But beef didn't really have much to do with it. Back then, cattle were mostly raised for their hides and to make tallow, a rendered form of suet that was useful for making candles, among other things. It wouldn't actually be until the late 19th century, when the railroads made transportation of cattle and meat over long distances much easier, that demand for beef really started to take off. It quickly became a major component of the American diet, and the cowboys who rode the range became American folk heroes. The early 20th century then brought some other technological innovations that kicked the industry into overdrive. Barbed wire fences were invented to protect herds of cattle and reduce conflicts between ranchers, and refrigerated railroad cars allowed the meat they cultivated to be carried all over the country. By the mid-20th century, ranches started to give way to feedlots, which streamlined the industry and maximized profits. Beef companies also started to become more aggressive about selectively breeding their cattle for faster growth and higher meat yields. That being said, the beef business isn't without its challenges. In fact, climate change and various other factors have called the sustainability of the entire business model into question, a problem the beef industry is still wrestling with. And speaking of business models, Americans love steakhouses, but they didn't invent them, not by a long shot. In fact, the earliest steakhouses predate the existence of the US as a country by a good 75 years or so. The oldest known examples started cropping up in London during the 1690s. Known as chop houses, a reference to the individual portions, or chops, of meat they served, these establishments were a good place for workers to get a hot meal. There were also beefsteak banquets. Like chop houses, beefsteak banquets served chops of meat, but unlike chop houses, they were not for workers. They were fancy-schmancy affairs for rich people, and they were invite-only, which is to say the beefsteak banquets weren't eateries as much as they were exclusive clubs. The American colonists were certainly familiar with chop houses and beefsteak banquets, but the steakhouse industry as we know it today was an outgrowth of more traditional bars and inns during the 19th century. The first proper American steakhouse may have been New York City's Delmonico's, which was, in its heyday, world famous for the creatively named Delmonico steak. Founded by Italian-Swiss immigrant brothers Giovanni and Pietro Delmonico, it first opened its doors in 1837 and is widely believed to be the first American dining establishment to ever refer to itself as a restaurant. They stole that word from the French, which used it to refer to eateries that were nicer than the average tavern. Delmonico's was certainly that, and their upscale approach would set the tone for the American steakhouse industry going forward. History is unclear on whether you could throw your peanut shells directly on the floor. The steakhouse industry would really take off a few decades later. New York City's Old Home Steakhouse, which can lay claim to the oldest continually operating steakhouse in the U.S., opened its doors way back in 1868. And in 1885, Keene's Steakhouse, which became a hangout for luminaries like Babe Ruth, J.P. Morgan, General Douglas MacArthur, and President Teddy Roosevelt, also opened its doors in New York City. Man, what did those guys talk about while waiting for their bloomin' onion? But it's not like New York had a monopoly on steakhouses. The Buckhorn Exchange in Denver, which started serving patrons in 1893, stands as one of the oldest continuing operating steakhouses that isn't in New York. St. Elmo Steakhouse in Indianapolis has been in its original location since 1902. Pacific Dining Car, which you might have spotted in movies like Chinatown and Training Day, has been doing its thing in Los Angeles since 1921.
You ever need to talk to the Fed, you talk to him first.
And Gene and Giorgetti has been open since 1941, making it the oldest steakhouse in Chicago. Of course, in America, the brass ring of retail food sales is a big chain of restaurants, and chain steakhouses have been a thing since the late 1950s. Sizzler Steakhouse, for example, was founded in California in 1958. Unlike many of the upscale, hoity-toity steakhouses of the previous era, Sizzler was casual and budget-friendly. They were also incredibly profitable, so their business model would be widely copied and quickly become the norm for U.S. steakhouses. The chain itself would go on to become one of the biggest in the U.S. over the subsequent decades, with over 270 locations in the U.S. alone at its peak. In the 1960s, however, Americans were obsessed with cowboys. Cowboy movies were widely popular, as were TV shows like Gunsmoke, The Lone Ranger, and Bonanza. One of the stars of that last one was actor Dan Blocker, and when he retired, he opened up a Western-themed steakhouse in Westport, Connecticut called the Bonanza Sirloin Pit. It was a big success, so naturally, someone stole the idea just 2 years later. Those someones were businessmen Norm Wise, Dan Lasater, and Charles Kleps, who opened the Ponderosa Steakhouse in Kokomo, Indiana, Ponderosa being the name of the ranch on Bonanza. Like Sizzler, both chains eschewed the traditional fancy steakhouse atmosphere in favor of a casual vibe, and customers seemed to like it.
Steak, baked potato, salad, and old-fashioned square deal prices.
The two chains would spend the next 20 years duking it out for cowboy-themed steakhouse supremacy and finally merge into a single company in the 1980s, bringing nearly 700 locations together under one roof. That's a lot of beef. The perplexingly named Ruth's Chris Steakhouse chain started out as Chris's Steakhouse in New Orleans in 1927. The original location eventually came to be owned by entrepreneur Ruth Fertel, which explains that club-footed name. And in 1976, she started franchising, creating the chain we know today. Of course, not every steakhouse chain had quite such deep and impressive roots. For example, Outback Steakhouse, which still has over 1,000 locations worldwide, only dates back to 1988. Lone Star Steakhouse, which had 267 locations at its peak, only got started in 1989. And Texas Roadhouse, which had over 800 locations at one point, only dates back to 1993. Nothing lasts forever, and the steakhouse boom of the 80s and 90s was no exception. What went wrong? Well, for starters, right around the turn of the millennium, the commercial steakhouse market became saturated and everyone's sales started to fall off. Additionally, trends towards healthier eating since the 1990s had a lot to do with it, as did the combined effect of the 2008 financial recession and the pandemic of 2020, which were both pretty brutal on sit-down restaurants in general. A series of controversies didn't help much either. For example, in 1993, Sizzler allowed their salad bars to be contaminated by E. coli infected meat, causing nearly 40 confirmed cases of food poisoning. You'd think they'd have learned their lesson, but it happened again at locations in Milwaukee in 2000. Ponderosa has been frequently accused of the same offense, but they had bigger problems. Namely, some of their franchisees were criminals. Fred Buxom, who owned 15 locations in Ohio, was eventually prosecuted for his role in a check-kiting scheme that amounted to nearly $850 million in bank fraud. And Scott A. Wildey, the owner of a Ponderosa in Indiana, wound up doing 2 years in the federal lockup for tax evasion, which is how they brought down Al Capone. Speaking of crime, steakhouses were frequent targets for robberies. Ponderosa was the victim of a highly publicized robbery in 1975. Another, in 1996, turned into a 12-hour standoff with police, and a third just 3 years later, which ended with the murder of its manager. Meanwhile, Lone Star developed a reputation for cutting corners. One reviewer from 1995, for example, reported being served an old, inedible piece of fish, which was only replaced with a fresher one after the reviewer, something the manager admitted the kitchen staff did frequently. As of 2024, Ponderosa and Bonanza Steakhouses have just 14 locations left, down from their peak of 700.
One of America's first casual restaurant chains has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection.
Sizzler had to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in 2020. And except for one lone location that remains open in Guam, of all places, Lone Star Steakhouse rode off to the Great Cattle Ranch in the sky in 2019. Of the surviving steakhouse chains, most had to cut back on locations since their heyday, and all have had to learn to adapt to a more challenging commercial landscape that places greater emphasis on delivery, technology, and healthy eating. That being said, the commercial steakhouse business may be making something of a comeback. Texas Roadhouse, for example, now has nearly 750 locations in the U.S., up from just under 700 last year. And in 2023, Brand Finance named them the fastest-growing restaurant brand, having seen a 56% increase in value over the year before. Outback Steakhouse is still operating over 1,000 locations worldwide, and as of their 2024 earnings call, they were planning to open around 20 more. Similarly, Longhorn Steakhouse recently announced plans to open around 15 new locations. And in 2023, their parent company, Darden, bought out the Ruth's Chris chain due to their optimism about the future of the upscale dining sector. Now if they'd only changed that tongue twister of a name. Things have been similarly rosy for the Capital Grille, STK, Steak 48, Texas de Brazil, and Brazilian steakhouse chain Fogo de Chao. Heck, hiring has even been up at Sizzler since they emerged from bankruptcy. After decades of waning popularity, steakhouses seem to be on their way back. But for now, it's time for a doggy bag because there's no way I'm finishing this all in one sitting. So, what do you think? Do you have a favorite steakhouse? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from Weird History.